Welcome to episode 6 of Claude's Unique Life, a reading of my grandfather's recorded memories. We find ourselves in the late 1930s, early 1940s, the family's growing, and World War II breaks out and changes everything. Picking up where I left off at the end of episode 5, in the fall of 1937, we learned there would be an addition to our family the next spring. Everyone was elated. When Ilsa put on her wedding gown for an anniversary picture, it was a little snug in one place. As time drew near, we visited the doctor frequently. We walked to his office, which was quite a long walk. Finally, we visited him, and he said, "Why don't you walk over to the hospital? You're about ready." The Roseland Hospital is only 2 or 3 blocks away. We checked Ilsa in that evening. At that time, husbands were not allowed to stay with their wives. There was a waiting room for them. Ilsa had a very hard time. She was in labor for several hours. The next morning, April 22nd, 1938, she gave birth to Judith Ida Gentry, who, by the way, is my mom. What a joy she was to her mother and I, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and friends. About this time, we moved into a U.S. government housing complex on the south side of Chicago. I believe it was the Trumbull Park Apartments, which I found online that they still exist, although I doubt they're the same physical building. We were on the second floor. We had a living room, bedroom, kitchen dining area, and a bath. It was very nice and brand new. We bought a bedroom set from Sears, and the springs and mattresses came, but not the bed, so we slept close to the floor for a night or two. Judy became allergic to tomatoes and some other foods. Her little face was broken out in red splotches. She had asthma so bad that we were afraid we were going to lose her. It was very difficult for her to breathe. We spent many hours making formula, washing bottles, and nipples for her. Then, to make matters worse, Ilsa contacted poison ivy on both of her arms. We cut the sleeves out of some of my shirts and put them over her arms so that she could handle Judy. We bought a little sled with sides on it and a handle on the back so it could be pushed. We pushed her all bundled up around South Chicago on occasions. When they froze the skating rink in the park near us, we would push her while we were ice skating. We pushed her in her baby carriage while bicycling. That must have been a sight. Ilsa held Bible classes for some children in the area, and Johnny Lane helped her. I remembered that the little girl who lived next door to us really caused a lot of trouble. Things were quite simple then, at least that is how we think of it now. When I could squeeze out an extra nickel, I would buy a candy bar for Ilsa. When working the night shift, I would arrive home early in the morning, and there was a small bakery near home. So as a treat, I would stop there and buy a few Long Johns or donuts from the bakers, and they were hot out of the oven. Ilsa loved them. I was still working at the Walgreens Drug Company, but it took about an hour and a half each way to and from work using the streetcars. I took 3 or 4 cars each way. I spent a lot of time standing. In those days, it was proper for men to give ladies their seats, and also for younger men to give their seats to older men. A person became very adept at hanging on to straps or standing free in spite of the sudden jerks and lurches of the car. Hopping on or off a moving car was often necessary. Some of the motormen, seeing a young man, would only slow down for you, so you had to hop on or off while it kept moving. They were cold in the winter and hot in the summer. I burned the soles of my shoes on the heaters located beneath the windows because it was warmer than resting feet on the floor. While living there, we bought our first car, Brother H.A.'s 1934 convertible Pontiac, which I believe is in this picture that I know I've used a couple times, but I think it's a great picture. After buying it, I would occasionally drive it to work. It only took about half as long to make the trip, but it cost a lot more, and we couldn't afford that much. One time, I ran out of gas and I had no money, but I had almost a gallon of kerosene in the trunk. Would you believe I poured it in the tank and drove home? Boy, did it throw a cloud of smoke. But the next time I tried to start it, it wouldn't start. Apparently, it ran on the way home because the motor was already hot, so I never put more kerosene in the gas tank. But one morning, on my way to work with the top down, it was quite foggy. As I went over a long bridge over some rail yards, the moisture condensed on the windshield and froze. A combination of speed, increase in altitude with a lower temperature, and the moisture-laden air caused it to freeze over. Now, the car had 2 spare wheels, one on each front fender and a well. Now, we had trouble keeping 4 tires on the road, much less keeping spares. We had tubes with patches on patches and boots in the tires. These boots were like a big patch inside the tires. Now, we didn't balance tires in those days. And to adjust the brakes, we would make a fast stop, then tighten the brake on the wheels that did not slide. Finally, we would get them all to slide more or less equally. In the winter, I did a couple of things to make it easier to start. If the temperature went below freezing, as it often does in Chicago, I added a pint or 2 of kerosene to the crankcase with the high test weight number 10W oil. In addition, I would turn the motor over half a dozen times with a hand crank. Yes, you heard that right, the hand crank, before trying the starter. And that would generally make it start. I would also use some high-test gas in the wintertime. Now, we didn't use snow tires back then. If you couldn't go, you put on chains. Now, that was a job for you, a cold, dirty, tough job. Eventually, it had almost 100,000 miles on it. It used oil pretty bad. So I replaced the motor with one from a 1933 or a 35 Pontiac, which had been wrecked. And we did this job in Ma Benke's yard. Once again, Ma Benke's yard. She really put up with a lot. The wrecked car body and old motor was sold to an auto salvage company. Switching those motors was quite a job. There were big 8-cylinder motors inline, not the V-type we have today. The change worked, and we drove that car for many more years. One Sunday night, December 7th, after church, we were all at the Benke's when we heard that Japan had bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now we knew that all the young men would be drafted. Now, Art had recently joined the Navy before he was drafted. The next day, Ken Allison joined the Air Force. He had just received his civilian pilot's license. And before long, Herbert, Joe, and H.A. were in the Army. Paul Benke and I were classed 3A because we each had a child. I finally was hired at the State Line Generating Plant as a laborer, and this was much closer to home. A cousin, Bob Bunch, and brother-in-law Lee McMurray worked there. My job at first was mowing and raking the yard and other such jobs. Later, I moved inside as a janitor. I was mopping floors, dusting and waxing the generators and other items in this huge building. At the time, they had the most efficient electrical system in the USA. From that job, I moved to the job of boiler cleaner. These are normal moves to eventually becoming an operator or an engineer. As a boiler cleaner, I became quite acquainted with all the equipment and how it worked. It would pulverize coal as fine as face powder, blowing it into the furnaces almost like a liquid, and how it would burn. Finally, we would bag very fine fly ash from the smokestacks, which was used in very fine concrete. We would break up slabs of slag from the bottom of the furnace and wash it into a slag pile. Also, the water intake and the filter system was involved. All the fuel, water, and streamlines and their valves and other hardware became very familiar. We checked the boilers to be sure slag was not building up on the water, steam, or superheater tubes. If it started building up, we took long tubes with a water hose attached on it, shoved it in the furnace, and knocked the slag off. It was a tough, hot job. Those boilers were 4 or 5 stories high. There was a lot of stairs to be climbing up and down. Poking slag in the basement was tough. Big, long steel bars were stuck up and jammed and pried against the slag to break it loose. When the large chunks came loose, they really knocked you around. The toughest job was cleaning the boilers when they were shut down periodically. Slag would finally build up so thick that it couldn't be knocked out. We then crawled inside using pickaxes and would knock out the slag. It was so hot that 2x12 boards we stood on would sometimes catch fire. We wore masks to be able to breathe in that dusty atmosphere. We did not have room to stand up. We worked on our knees with our heads down. We worked as long as we could stand it, and then we would crawl out and rest on the gratings or metal walkways that were outside the boilers. Then back inside the boilers we would go. Sometimes we did this for 2 shifts at a time. I think I weighed about 175 pounds at a time. Now, he was over 6 foot tall, so that's pretty skinny. One time, while on top of one of the boilers checking out superheater tubes, my glasses fell off and down into the furnace. Goodbye, glasses. We worked in rotating shifts. About the time you became used to a shift, it would change. 12 to midnight to 8 a.m. was good because you could do as you pleased through the day and evening, but it was hard to find time to sleep. There were some exciting as well as dangerous and tiring times also. Twice a day, there was a heavy demand for electricity. Early in the evening, as lights and stoves were turned on, and early in the morning, as they were again turned on, and as industry started up for the day. Sometimes I would have a job of adjusting a large feed water valve to keep the proper amount of water in boilers, as more steam was required to increase the generator output to provide that extra electricity. Too much water would reduce the ability of the boilers to produce the required steam, and too little water would allow some tubes in the boilers to melt. I don't remember having a problem with it, but it was exciting. This was a large plant that had a lot of instruments in it for measuring and or controlling flow of fluids, temperature, pressure, and so forth. I thought it was interesting, so I inquired about working on them. I took an evening course at Purdue College Extension in Hammond, Indiana. Just before completing the course, a man who had been a meter reader for the gas company was given the job. One of the instructors was the manager of the Chicago service division of Brown Instruments, which was a division of the Minneapolis-based Honeywell Regulator Company. When I told him what happened, he asked if I had considered working for Brown Instruments. They were looking for 2 men, so he arranged for an interview for me with 2 of his managers. I talked to them, and they had me take an exam. It took most of the day. A few anxious weeks later, I was advised that I could have a job with them. My mechanical ability was the highest that they had tested. I was selected as one of 2 hired out of a large number who had been tested. The other was a college graduate who had several years' experience in the instrument field. I took the job in the spring of 1942. When I told my boss at State Line I would be leaving just before my vacation unless I would lose it, in which case I would work a little longer. He said that would not be a problem, that I would still receive the vacation pay. Well, I did not receive it. The hire manager said that vacation is a rest for the coming year. How about that? By the way, one night while driving to the evening school on a 4-lane highway, 2 lanes in each direction without a divider, I was passing a tractor-trailer in a car from the opposite direction headed right toward me. I was alongside the trailer. I prayed and turned to the left toward oncoming traffic. That car went between me and the trailer, and I pulled safely back into my lane. The Lord is good. At Brown Instruments, I was asked if I would move out of Chicago if needed elsewhere. I told them yes, but I would prefer to stay in the Chicago area where most of my family lived. For a month or so, I worked in the Chicago area, going out with servicemen on calls to get an idea of how they worked and the industries and instruments involved. That's how I started. It was very interesting. During this time, we moved out of the government housing project, staying with the Benke family a short time before going to Philadelphia for a 3-month training course at Brown Instrument School, which was in the Germantown area of Philadelphia. Your dear, precious mother was now pregnant with her 2nd child. I believe my starting salary was $100 a month. I received traveling expenses and around $20 a week living expense while in Philadelphia. It was very tight living. We drove our 34 Pontiac convertible, and the first night we made it to the first town in Ohio. The second night we reached Pittsburgh. The third night, we reached the east end of the Pennsylvania Turnpike just west of Harrisburg. Now, there were no interstates at that time. The Pennsylvania Turnpike ran just from east of Pittsburgh to west of Harrisburg, and it was very advanced for that time. Your dear mother is something else. She put up with a lot, never complaining. We lived in a pretty small, cramped quarters and at one time shared an apartment with the other family, including their 2 children. This was on Schleton Avenue. We enjoyed the weekends. We visited Valley Forge, the Wissachokin Creek area, I'm not positive on the pronunciation there, and Philadelphia historic sites and Barnhouse's Church. While living on Chilton Avenue, we attended the Chilton Avenue Baptist Church, which was about a block from us. We were surprised to find the pastor was Reverend Allen. He had a streak of white hair in his dark hair. He and his brother had held evangelistic meetings in the South Chicago Baptist Church when I was a teenager, and I think he stayed at our house during those meetings. I enjoyed the school, but I had to do a lot of studying at night, but managed to be second or third from the top of the class. World War II was in full swing. Art visited us a couple weekends when his ship was at Portsmouth or Kittery, Maine. He called Judy his little Navy nurse because she wore a blue cape, which we lost in a picnic in the Wissachokin with him. Joe was training in an anti-aircraft battery, AJ was training in Texas, Herb was in the Army, and Ken was in the Air Force. Originally, I had been classified 3A, deferred because of being married with 1 child. Later, I was 1N because I was necessary to support the war effort by keeping instruments in good working order in the war plants in Indiana, Kentucky, and some counties in Michigan. Now, I want to add a personal observation here. Many years ago, we were attending church on Sunday morning in the retirement village that my grandparents lived in. It was a veterans weekend. So the pastor invited all of the veterans to stand up. Now, of course, being a retirement community, there are a lot of people around his age, and he sat there and almost everybody his age stood up. And I could tell by his body language that really bothered him. He never wore the uniform, but he served in his own way, helping keep the American war machine going, and he did some critical things that I may talk about in a later video, we'll say. But I can tell it bothered him that he hadn't worn the uniform. So anyway, back to the story. Gasoline was very scarce at that time. It got so bad in Philadelphia that people would follow a tanker truck to the station where it would unload, and they'd buy gas as soon as it was unloaded. When it was close to the end of school, I asked the owner of the little station if he would fill up a 5-gallon can for me to take on the trip home to be sure we wouldn't be stranded. He advised me he would fill my car's tank, and that would be more than enough to get to the turnpike, and they had plenty of gas from there on to Chicago. The gasoline shortage apparently was only on the East Coast, and turned out he was right. The only problem was driving one night on the turnpike, the old Pontiac seemed sluggish and was almost overheating. Finally, we reached one of the many tunnels and realized we had been going uphill for a long time. After reaching Chicago, we moved into a little apartment which was rented to us by a friend of Ma Benke. I started servicing Brown Instruments in the Chicago area. I went to bakeries, steel mills, electric generating plants, can manufacturing companies, etc. They offered me a job at the instrument department at State Line, but I refused because I felt like Honeywell had gone to a lot of expense to train me. So I stayed at Honeywell. After being in Chicago for a month or so, I was asked to move to Indianapolis, Indiana. My boss didn't want me to drive our old 34 Pontiac on service calls. He felt like it would ruin the image of Honeywell. So they gave me a Chevy Coupe, which had been used by someone else. So we sold the beautiful old convertible, and the one we drove was a 41 Chevy, and I drove it all during the war. Houses were very hard to find to rent at that time during the war. I was about to start following moving vans to see where a house was being emptied, but the Lord was good. He led us to a house just being finished by a builder who intended to live there himself, but it was at the east end of town, and his wife wouldn't move there. So he rented it to us. It was a nice 2-bedroom brick bungalow with a fireplace, a nice front porch, and a separate garage, and even a full basement. After returning to Indianapolis with the family while waiting for our furniture to arrive by Mayflower, we stayed in a little motel. When the furniture arrived, we moved in, and an awful catastrophe occurred. Our 4-year-old Judy could not find her favorite stuffed bunny. She had a tough time going to sleep without it. We thought she had left it at the motel, but I checked the next day and it was not to be found. The Lord was so good through those years. Your mother put up with a lot. My working long hours, occasionally gone for 2 or 3 days at a time. She is so precious. That's the end of episode 6. In episode 7, there's a little tidbit about the Manhattan Project that might have otherwise been lost to history. So I hope you tune in for that, and keep in mind Claude was an engineer by then, so there you go. So, thanks for watching.